The series is entitled Love, Sex, and Relationships in Jewish Tradition. Our program for today is Communication Gone Awry. As I mentioned in the email that you received from me, there should be a link to the handout for today's program. So if for some reason you don't have that link, and there's many of you that don't have it, then we will try to figure out what to do about that. And maybe Avi can share it if necessary. This program is underwritten by the Community Scholar Program, which means you people, because you are our supporters. So I want to thank you. We are just about ending our 19th year of programs in Orange County and heading into our 20th year, which we'll be celebrating starting in May. We'll be celebrating, I guess, privately, but maybe we'll have a bigger celebration in a few months when we're able to do that. So I want to thank you all for supporting CSP for the past 19 years. I hope you will continue to support us so we can continue to do great programs. We have tons of programs we're doing online, and that's because of you. Upcoming programs I wanted to mention are as follows. What's today? Today is the 23rd. So Paul Lips returns on Sunday at noon. Part 3, Politics and Politicians, Shimon Peres, he'll be focusing on. That's a very big crowd, and I hope you'll join us for that. We have Robbie Greengrass, the 4 key questions that answer everything about Israel. We're doing that in honor of Yom HaAtzmaut. It's April 28th, next week. April 29th, another program related to Israel, Ancient Synagogues in the Land of Israel, with the very well-known, renowned archaeologist Jody Magnus, who we've had for a few programs in Orange County. And then April 30th is part 2 of Avi's series, Love, Sex, and Relationships. We're focusing on love is sacrifice. Everybody is muted. We will be doing this program in an interactive fashion, in that as we go along, if you have questions, please chat them. And Avi, you'll be able to see, can you see the chat right now, for example? Be able to see the chat and see what kind of questions people have. So we'll stop and we'll start that way. So we're not going to save, you don't have to save questions for the end. You can actually ask your questions as we go along. And I'll say a few things about Avi as I let more people into our group. And then I'll have Avi say a little bit about Hadar, the organization that she works for. But Avi is in DC, and the Hadar, I think, is centered in New York City, correct?
Yep. Okay.
So just to buy time as people come in off of our waiting room. I'll admit a few more people. Hold on. Rabbi Avi Strausberg is the Director of National Learning Initiatives at Hadar and is based in Washington, D.C. She received her rabbinic ordination from Hebrew College in Boston, which is right down the street from where my parents live in Newton, and is a Wexner Graduate Fellow. She also holds a master's in Jewish education. Energized by engaging creatively with Jewish texts, she has written several theater pieces inspired by the Torah and maintains a Daf Yomi haiku blog in which she writes daily Talmudic haikus. I'm sure if I missed something, Avi, you'll add to it. I'm going to mute myself so that the screen will be all yours. Again, thank you everybody for joining us. And this is part 1 of a 5-part series. So looking forward to having you here for the next 5 Thursdays. Thank you.
Great. Okay, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's wonderful to be learning with you all in the middle of your day, in the middle of my day. So I'm Avi Strausberg. I'm in DC. And I've been with Hadar for 2 years. So Hadar is an educational institution. It's based on the Upper West Side of New York. It started as a yeshiva, full-time learning program for a year program and a summer program for students who would come to us to learn Torah all day long from 7:30 a.m. to 9 o'clock at night. And now we do all sorts of programming. We have week-long programs, day-long programs, weekly Divrei Torah that go out, a lot of online robust content that goes out, and my job is bringing Hadar's learning to DC and also nationally. So it's particularly in this moment where everything is happening via Zoom, I'm getting to do a lot of learning with people all over the country. So that's particularly exciting. So the course we're going to be looking at today is a favorite one of mine, Love, Sex, and Relationships in Jewish Tradition. So I've done a fair amount of learning And I have to say that as I'm doing learning, the texts that always call out to me and excite me the most are texts that are talking about relationships, whether it's romantic relationships or relationship between friends or teachers and students. It's the moment when the rabbis, who are often the subjects, the rabbis, as they're writing their own stories into the Mishnah and the Talmud. I'll say in a moment a word about what those are. Oftentimes the rabbis are just talking, sort of working through the messiness of their own lives. So as they're talking about relationships and forgiveness and love and rebuke and all these sorts of things, they are their own subjects. And I find it's always particularly exciting to stumble upon a story in the Talmud in which the rabbis are wrestling with the forgiveness, or the rabbis are wrestling with love, or the rabbis are wrestling with compromise. And sometimes they succeed, sometimes they stumble. But I think that there's a lot of wisdom that we can mine from seeing sort of the messiness of how they sort of muddle through it, and the sort of the sense that they're trying to make. I also think it's sort of incredible that some of the questions that we ask ourselves today, what does a healthy relationship look like? What is a fair amount of compromise in a partnership? What should a healthy sex life look like? That these are some of the same questions that the rabbis, 1,500 years ago are wrestling with. So that's part of the work that we're going to be doing today, is turning to these rabbinic texts from many, 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 many centuries ago, and seeing what wisdom might we mine there together, and what might it reflect on our own lives. And just a word about the type of relationships we're going to be looking at in the course. So in terms of romantic relationships, the rabbis are going to assume sort of a heteronormative male sexual relationship. While those are the texts that we're going to be looking at, I think we can take relationships beyond the pages of what the rabbis are imagining, and think about all sorts of different types of relationships, not just sort of sticking to whatever sort of the heteronormative frame that they had in mind. And also, I would say, even though the course is love, sex, and relationships in Jewish tradition, some of the relationships we'll be looking at are romantic. But this is not a course that's just about romantic relationships. Really, it's about what wisdom might we find for all of our relationships, and our parent-child relationships, and our partnerships at work, and navigating mentor or employee relationships, and navigating close friendships. That I think a lot of the teachings we're going to be looking at together are both applicable both in our romantic relationships and partnerships, but also really beyond that. So in our course together, for those of you that are going to be here with the full 5-parter, we're going to cover a lot of topics together. We're going to start off looking at communication. Really, that is the basis. Why start there? Because communication is really the basis of any relationship, and we can't get anywhere without the communication. We're going to be looking at partnership and balance. What is it? How much do we give and take in a relationship? How do I stay strong in myself while also compromising and making space for my partner? We're going to be looking at how to say when something is wrong, how to communicate our needs, how to give feedback when something's not working for us, which is something that's so important and also can be so difficult to do in a relationship. And we're also going to be looking at rabbinic views on what constitutes healthy desire and healthy sex. I think it can be a little bit surprising to stumble across rabbinic teachings on sex, but it turns out that the rabbis thought and talked about sex a lot of times. And so I think some of those last texts that we'll look at in our last sessions may be quite actually eye-opening to see, the rabbis also have this to say. What do the rabbis have to say about love and sex and relationships? So that's just to give you a general overview of where we're hoping to get to. In our first class today, we're really going to be diving into communication. The idea for this particular session is I find myself, oftentimes I'm watching a movie or I'm watching a show, and I see the characters getting into a fight with each other, and you just see them, miscommunicating. We're sort of refusing to understand each other. If you've ever found yourself yelling at the screen and saying, but if you would just stop and listen to each other, you could save this whole fight, right? Like you see it going off the tracks. Why won't they just stop and listen? And that's part of what we're going to be looking at today, of what happens in relationships when communication goes wrong. Where might that be happening? in our own relationships? What are the places in our relationships where it's actually really difficult for us to communicate with people that we care about? And why is it so difficult? And might we learn some lessons from these stories we're going to be looking at of communication gone wrong? How might that, when we find ourselves stuck in our own relationships, in our own old patterns of communicating, how might that sort of offer us wisdom so we can move through that in our own relationships? Part of the thing that I want to explore is how easy it is as a human being to get stuck in our own narrative of a particular event, and how difficult it is sometimes to get out of our head and to hear the other person. So that's what we're going to be exploring today. Just a word about the text we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at the Mishnah and the Talmud today. So you have the Torah, which is the 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You have the Mishnah, which is the first attempt to make a legal code from the Torah from 0 to 200 CE. The Mishnah is organized into different tractates that are thematically organized. And then you have the Gemara or the Talmud. I'll use those words interchangeably. That's the commentary on the Mishnah, and that's from 200 to 500 CE. The Mishnah assumed a lot of knowledge. It spoke very tersely. And so when the next generation of rabbis in 200 came along, they already didn't really understand how to apply the Mishnah. And so the Gemara is those later rabbis debating and dissecting and figuring out how to apply the Mishnah. Okay, I'm going to just drop the source sheet into the chat so everyone should have it, or you'll have it in your email for when you registered. So hopefully everyone has the source sheet there. And I'll just reiterate what Awry said, that you're welcome to, if questions are coming up, I'll try to keep track of the chat. So you're welcome to talk slower. That's fair. Thank you. So I'm open to your comments, and you're welcome to drop questions into the chat. I can't promise that I'll respond as I see them, but I will promise that I will pause at moments and turn to the chat to see what are you thinking about. In the ideal, this session would be very interactive, and I would love to hear your thoughts on all of these texts. And so we're gonna try to manage that as best as we can in this new Zoom technology. Okay, any questions or thoughts on any of that opening? I'll give you in the moment in the chat and a moment to get yourself situated with the source sheet. Okay, so without further ado, we are going to dive into our first source. So our first source comes from the Gemara. It comes from Masechet Bava Metzia, which is a Masechet that's dealing with interpersonal relationships, business relationships, partnerships, how we're supposed to sort of handle disagreements. And this is a text in which we're going to encounter 2 rabbinic figures, Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, 2 famous rabbis. We're going to see that Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan have quite a special and intense friendship and a relationship. And we're going to see that something goes very wrong in their relationship. So I'm going to read the text for you, and I'm going to pause at moments, and I really would love to use the chat in this way. I want to pause at moments, and I'm going to turn to you in the chat to ask you, what's going on for each of the characters? Why are they acting the way they are? Why are they saying the things they're saying? And see if we can get to the bottom of what goes wrong in this relationship, okay? So we are on the source sheet. We're on the very first text, Bava Metzia, 84a. Okay. Yom Echad, Have Kasachi Rabbi Yochanan b'Yardena. So one day, Rabbi Yochanan was bathing in the Jordan. And Reish Lakish saw him and jumped into the Jordan, pursuing him. So part of what I want you to be thinking about in your head as we're reading this together, and I'm going to ask you this in a minute to chat it into the chat, I want you to be thinking about what are all the questions that this text raises for you. What is interesting? What are your questions about this text, okay? So here's the scene. Rabbi Yochanan is presumably naked. He's bathing in the Jordan. He's perhaps doing a mikveh and immersing in the water. And Reish Lakish sees Rabbi Yochanan and jumps into the water to pursue him. That's the start of our story. Just to say a note about the text before us, I pulled it from Sefaria. So the bolded text is close to the literal translation of the text. What is not bolded is like the interpretive filler. So I'm not necessarily going to read the interpretive filler because sometimes the interpretive filler is doing all the work for us and we don't want to rely on that. So I'm going to try to read what's bolded. Okay, that's what is meant to be the literal translation. So Rabbi Yochanan was bathing in the Jordan, and Reish Lakish saw him and jumped into the Jordan, pursuing him. Rabbi Yochanan said to Reish Lakish, "Your strength is for Torah." Reish Lakish said to Rabbi Yochanan, "Your beauty is for women." Rabbi Yochanan said to him, "If you return, I will give you my sister, who is more beautiful than I am." Reish Lakish accepted upon himself to study Torah, and then Reish Lakish wanted to jump back out of the river to bring back his clothes, but he was unable to return. Okay, so a lot going on in that little interlude of a story. Feel free to type into the chat now, what are the questions that this first section brings up for you? What's confusing, interesting, surprising? What are your questions here? Good. Okay, I love all the questions that are coming in. Okay, so what is strength? So amazing. Okay, good. These are so many questions that we can talk about. So I love Beth's question. Did Reish Lakish want to rob him, or did he follow him because he thought he was attractive? What caused, right, again, Dennis is saying, what caused Reish to jump in to pursue Rabbi Yochanan? So the background to Reish Lakish that some of us may know is that Reish Lakish was a bandit. The whole idea here is that he's returning to Torah, which is to say he's not currently living a life of Torah. So it's interesting that you have this bandit who has his weapons, who's going about his bandit ways. He sees this rabbi naked bathing in the water, and for some reason he's compelled to jump in. You might think that if he was going to rob him, it actually would probably be better if he just grabbed, presumably Rabbi Yochanan's clothes were also somewhere by the side of the river. It would make sense for him to just grab whatever's in Rabbi Yochanan's clothes and go on. But the fact that he jumps in after him is an interesting thing. Okay, so we have this comment, the question, what is strength? So that's great. So part of that goes into the text. So one of the question is, why does Rabbi Yochanan jumped in? Why does Reish Lakish jump in? It seems like that's an interesting question, whether it's some sort of attraction for Rabbi Yochanan or some sort of attraction is the text on our screen. So Irene, you can find it in the chat. I'll just reshare it. You can click on the Google Doc there to get access to it. So I'm just resharing that for anyone who came in. There you go. Okay, so Reish Lakish jumps in, and then Rabbi Yochanan says the strange things to him. He says, your strength is fit for Torah. And so one of the questions there is, what did Rabbi Yochanan mean when he said your strength is for Torah? Part of it seems to be, on one hand, Rabbi Yochanan is commenting on Reish Lakish's physicality. He's commenting, perhaps alluding to his banditry, to his strength as a bandit. And he's saying, perhaps, what does the text say, pursuing him? Right? It's very interesting, the pursuit that's happening between these two people here. And so Rabbi Yochanan perhaps is saying to Reish Lakish, you are misusing your strength. You are using your strength to go after people sort of in these brute bandit ways. And perhaps it would be better if you were going after Torah. Reish Lakish says back to him, your beauty is fit for women. How do you understand that comment? Your beauty is fit for women. Is Reish Lakish offering him a compliment? Is he criticizing him in some way? What's meant by that comment? Part of what I want to really interrogate here is there's always there's the thing that we're saying, and then there's the subtext. So what is the subtext of this conversation? Reish Lakish says, your beauty is fit for women, but what does he actually mean by that? Any thoughts there? Okay. This is my 5-year-old who just woke up. Okay, thanks. He's attracted to Rabbi Yochanan. Right. Good. Okay, so one read on that, your beauty is fit for women, is that Reish Lakish, and this sort of goes with the idea that Reish Lakish jumps in after him, when Rabbi Yochanan is naked, is that perhaps there actually is an attraction, and that Rabbi Yochanan and that Reish Lakish is pursuing him in some way, that there's a real attraction there. Okay, great. How else might we understand Reish Lakish's comment, your beauty is fit for women? Good. Beth says, maybe they each think the other is misusing their strengths, right? That Reish Lakish is saying, you are beautiful, and instead of spending all of your time studying Torah, you should be with women. Okay? So another read on this is Rabbi Yochanan is saying, you're spending all this time on banditry, but really your strength should be for Torah. And Reish Lakish is saying, you have this strength in your beauty that you're spending all your time alone in the Beit Midrash on Torah, but really you should be with women. So perhaps they're noticing something there. And again, I think that there is the question, the pursuit there. This is going to be important when we get sort of deeper into what goes wrong in their relationship, is what's actually going on in their relationship. So, okay, interestingly, then Rabbi Yochanan's response to your beauty is fit for women is, if you return, I'll give you my sister who is more beautiful than I am. Interesting proposal. Again, if you're sort of going the route of there's perhaps some sort of attraction or something romantic there, Rabbi Yochanan is saying, well, you can't have me, but you can, what in our relationship today, what you could have is my sister. Or perhaps this is just further encouragement to say, listen, really what you need to be doing is Torah. And if the thing that's going to get you there is Torah, is like being with a decent woman, being with my sister, I'm going to try to bring you into the fold. Okay, ultimately Reish Lakish agrees to this, but once he agrees, something strange happens. He no longer has the strength to grab his clothes, right? It's as if he wants to return to his old life to pick up his clothes, and he's not able to pick up his clothes. He's like, somehow his strength has changed in some way. Okay, just want to take a moment to look at your comments. Yeah, it's beautiful, Dennis. You comment on how strong I am. Your beauty is remarkable. It's an amazing interchange for two men naked in a river, one of them a rabbi. And I want to spend more time with you, right? I think that there is another level on how can I spend more time with you? Perhaps that there's some relationship that it couldn't have, and now it's going to be rechanneled into Torah and the Beit Midrash. Okay, so let's see. So this is the beginning of Reish Lakish's and Rabbi Yochanan's relationship, an interesting start, and let's see where their relationship goes and what happens. So we're going to go back into the text now. So Reish Lakish agrees, and he wants to have this life of Torah. So Rabbi Yochanan taught Reish Lakish Bible and taught him Mishnah and turned him into a Gavra Rabbah, turned him into a great man. And this is true. This, the interpreter is going to give you this. But Reish Lakish, who starts out as a bandit, becomes one of the great scholars. His name is all over the Talmud. One day, the sages of the study hall were engaging in a dispute concerning the following text, a Baraita. A Baraita is just a text from the same time as the Mishnah, from 0 to 200 CE. So they were all just studying this particular conversation with regard to the sword, the knife, the dagger, the spear, a hand sickle, and a harvest sickle. From when are they susceptible to ritual impurity? Okay, the question here was not super important for us, is that in the days of purity and impurity, which was really important for your status in terms of bringing an offering to the temple, something could only become impure once it was complete. If an object was still in the process of being built, then it couldn't be impure, like sort of was a non-object. So the question here is, at what point are these objects, when they're being built, considered complete such that they can become impure? That's the question on the table. So the text answers, it is from the time of the completion of their manufacture. The sages then ask another question. And when is the completion of their manufacture? How do we know when something is officially done being built, when it is complete? So here's the disagreement. Rabbi Yochanan says it is from when one fires these items in the furnace. Reish Lakish says it's from when one scours them in water. So the idea being, first you would fire the items in a furnace. First you would fire the items in a furnace, and then after you would dunk them in cold water, and that would be the final step to harden them. So there's two different possible moments that could be the final moment, and that's what we're disagreeing about. So Rabbi Yochanan said to Reish Lakish, a bandit knows about his banditry. Okay, so here's the dispute. they're arguing, interestingly, the topic matter is what time these sort of weapons are complete such that they can become impure. Reish Lakish he says one thing at this moment, Rabbi Yochanan says another moment, they're disagreeing with each other. And so Rabbi Yochanan then says to Reish Lakish, a bandit knows about his banditry. What do you think that Rabbi Yochanan meant by that comment? So this is going back to, the overall question is, sometimes there are the things we say, and there's a subtext of what we mean. How do you think Rabbi Yochanan meant that? What did he mean when he said to Reish Lakish? So take a moment to chat that. Great. So Wendy says, sounds like it takes one to know one. I assume, Wendy, normally the way we use that, there's like a negative connotation to that. That's with that tone of it takes one to know one. I think if we were doing this in person, something that I would love doing with this line is to have someone read out the tone of Rabbi Yochanan saying, a bandit knows his banditry. What's the tone? A bandit knows his banditry, right, Wendy? It takes one to know one. Okay, it could be read as a diss on Reish Lakish, right? Well, you're a bandit. I guess you would know. Total put down for someone who's come so far. Right. And this is the whole point of this, is that Reish Lakish, was a bandit. And now for years, he's no longer a bandit. He's a great scholar. He's Rabbi Yochanan's chavruta, his sparring partner. They're the ones that are always together in Beit Midrash. And yet when it comes to this dispute, it's like a total put down of erasing all those years of work. One that deviates from halakha is a bandit. The expert about purity of these things is a maker of these, right? So I wonder what the tone of that last comment is. Once a bandit, always a bandit. Yeah. So the question is, so I think most of these have a negative connotation there. I think most of these are reading Rabbi Yochanan as with that tone of, well, I guess you would know, conceding the argument in that way. I think it's also possible to read it a different way. I think it's possible to read it even sort of more neutrally, like, well, I guess I guess this is the tone. Well, I guess you would know. I mean, I guess you do know about weapons more than I know about them. It could be Rabbi Yochanan sort of like playfully even saying, perhaps you would know, or it could be Rabbi Yochanan actually conceding the point to him. But it does seem like the go-to for a lot of us is that negative context. Okay, so let's see, how does Reish Lakish take it? So Reish Lakish responds and says, what benefit did you provide for me? And the sort of the interpretation there is, what have you done for me, right? There, I was called leader, and here I was called leader. So to the extent at which I think it's not clear 100% how you might have interpreted Rabbi Yochanan's comment, a bandit knows his banditry, Reish Lakish takes it a very specific way. Reish Lakish is very defensive, and he says to his close friend, Rabbi Yochanan, he says, what good did you ever do to me? I was fine there, and I was fine here. You did nothing, okay? And how is Rabbi Yochanan going to respond? Rabbi Yochanan also responds this defensively. Rabbi Yochanan said, I provided benefit to you as I brought you close to God under the wings of the divine presence. Reish Lakish says, you didn't do anything for me. I was a master there, and I was a master here. And Rabbi Yochanan defensively says, of course I did something for you. I brought you close to God. That's what I did for you, okay? What goes wrong in this moment? What goes wrong in this conversation? If you wanted to, this is a kind of conversation where I would like to hit the pause button and say, hold up. Let's replay the conversation. How could we have had this conversation be different? So what do you think goes wrong in this conversation? Why does Rabbi Yochanan respond this way? And why does Reish Lakish respond this way? While you are chatting in answers, maybe they're not really saying what they mean. Curious to hear more about that, Wendy. Rabbi Yochanan spoke in an unclear way. Had he meant it in a positive fashion, he should have said so. Okay, great. So maybe part of the problem is either he meant it as a put down, or if I think part of what I want to read into your comment here is that Rabbi Yochanan should know Reish Lakish, and he should know that his old friend is going to be sensitive about something like this. And so if he really meant it playfully or as something positive, he had to be clear about that, because he should have anticipated that his friend Reish Lakish was going to be sensitive and might be triggered by this comment. As Rabbi Yochanan worried that his student disagrees. Right, so is this a moment of the teacher is okay with the student rising so high? They become equals in a sense. They're chavrutas, they're learning partners. But then in this moment of disagreeing, for some reason, there's something about this disagreement that pushes Rabbi Yochanan and causes him to say this thing, jealousy. Reish Lakish is understandably upset. Rabbi Yochanan should have just apologized. Right, how would this conversation have been different if, so Rabbi Yochanan would say, a bandit knows his banditry. Reish Lakish would say, what good did you ever do to me? And then Rabbi Yochanan would say, whoa, I didn't mean to upset you, right? I'm so sorry, I obviously triggered something. That's not what I meant. And then Rabbi Yochanan could have backed off it, and then we could have gone in a different way. But for whatever reason, all about the rivalry, can't take it off. For whatever reason, there's something about this particular disagreement that both of them dig in. And how often does that happen in our lives, where for some reason we just dig in? And this is going back to what is the nature of the relationship, that there's an attraction, a romantic, whatever it is, there's definitely sort of an intensity. There's something complicated about their relationship. There's also a deep closeness in their relationship. The question for me is, why this moment? Why this disagreement? And presumably they've disagreed about things, and that's part of what it means to learn in chavruta with someone, is to disagree with them, right? To disagree and try to clarify the truth. But what is it about this moment that for some reason they both just dig in? Okay, so let's see what happens in the story. As a result of the quarrel, Rabbi Yochanan was offended, which in turn affected Reish Lakish, who fell ill. So Rabbi Yochanan gets offended because Reish Lakish now insulted him. And Reish Lakish is so upset that Rabbi Yochanan is upset, Reish Lakish falls ill. Rabbi Yochanan's sister, who sure enough did marry Reish Lakish, as was suggested by the beginning of the story, Rabbi Yochanan's sister comes crying to Rabbi Yochanan, begging that they will make up, because she's worried that Reish Lakish, her husband, is going to die. So the sister says to her brother, Rabbi Yochanan, she says to him, do this for the sake of my children. Rabbi Yochanan, so stubborn, quotes back to her a verse from Jeremiah and says, leave your fatherless children, I will rear them, right? Rabbi Yochanan says, I don't care if he dies, I'll take care of them, quoting this verse from Jeremiah. So she says back to him, do this for the sake of my own widowhood. She says to him, this fight is so bad, Reish Lakish is going to die from it. You don't want your own sister to be a widow, do it for my sake. He said to her the rest of the verse from Jeremiah, and let your widows trust in me. He said, fine. If he dies, you'll be a widow, and I'll be the one to take care of you, right? This is the fight that sometimes we dig in so deeply, there's no coming back from it. It's sometimes those relationships where you've written someone off 10 years ago, and you can't actually remember why you're in a fight with them. This is that they had this disagreement about manufacturing weapons and purity. Who even cares about this? And Rabbi Yochanan is willing to let Reish Lakish die. He's willing to let his sister become a widow, to let the children be fatherless, because he can't bring himself to apologize for this comment about a bandit knows about his banditry. So what happens in the story? Ultimately, Reish Lakish, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, dies. Sort of an incredible story about the way in which emotional conflict and inner turmoil can manifest in death, can manifest in physical pain. Rabbi Yochanan was sorely pained over losing him. The rabbis see that Rabbi Yochanan is so upset, and they say, who will go to calm Rabbi Yochanan's mind? They said, let Rabbi Elazar ben Padat go, as his statements are sharp. So the rabbis see that Rabbi Yochanan is inconsolable, that he's lost his favorite chavruta, this man who he's had a deep relationship with, and they say, we've got to send someone to go help. Let's send Rabbi Elazar ben Padat. He's sharp, he's smart, Rabbi Yochanan will like him. What happens to this poor guy? Rabbi Elazar ben Padat went and sat before Rabbi Yochanan. With regard to every matter that Rabbi Yochanan would say, Rabbi Elazar ben Padat would say to him, there's a ruling which is taught that supports you, right? Everything that Rabbi Yochanan would say, Rabbi Elzer would just say, you're right, you're right. Here's the teaching that proves you're right. And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, are you comparable to the son of Lakish? That's a nickname for Reish Lakish. He would say, are you like Reish Lakish? And my discussions with Reish Lakish, when I would state a matter, he would raise 24 difficulties against me. And I would answer him with 24 answers. And the halakha, the law by itself, would become broadened. And yet you say to me, there's a ruling that supports you. Do I not know that what I say is good? So they send in this guy who is the yes man just to support whatever Rabbi Yochanan was saying. And he says, that's not what I want. I want what I had with Reish Lakish. What did he have with Reish Lakish? They just argued all the time. They debated anything that Rabbi Yochanan said. Reish Lakish would challenge him 24 ways, and then Rabbi Yochanan would respond with 24 answers, right? And so that's, I think, part of what goes to the question of what happened in this particular dispute, that their whole relationship was, as Wendy was saying, their whole relationship is pushing each other to be better. It's clarifying and challenging. And so why this one moment did it go so wrong? And that's what Rabbi Yochanan misses. He misses really being challenged deeply in that way. What happens, Rabbi Yochanan went around rending his clothing, weeping, signs of being in mourning, and saying, where are you, son of Lakish? Where are you, son of Lakish? Rabbi Yochanan screamed until his mind was taken from him. The rabbis prayed and requested for God to have mercy on him, and Rabbi Yochanan died. That last line is very interesting. And the Aramaic is that the rabbis prayed for mercy, and Rabbi Yochanan died. And so the question there is, what is the prayer that the rabbis prayed? Did the rabbis pray for mercy like he would find relief and comfort? Or was the mercy that they prayed for that he should die so that because it was too much for him? That sometimes praying for mercy is actually, perhaps in this text suggesting, praying for the death because it's too much for Rabbi Yochanan. It's a very intense story. It's a story of, this is not necessarily a romantic love. Perhaps it is, but it's not necessarily on the surface for the rabbis. But it's a story of a deep, deep friendship, close chavrutas that get into this dispute, a small, insignificant dispute where every day they would have disputes. But for some reason, one day, Rabbi Yochanan says this comment, Reish Lakish responds defensively, Rabbi Yochanan responds defensively, and that ends an entire relationship, and ultimately both of them die, right? Reish Lakish is so sick over the fight, and then Rabbi Yochanan ultimately dies from this as well. So I'm curious just to hear your thoughts. What do you make of this story? What might we take from the story in terms of our own relationships? What's the wisdom here? That says don't take things for granted, right? Don't take things for granted. Don't take people for granted. Sometimes the way we take for granted the people that we love, the people we care about. Sometimes you take for granted that you can even say hurtful things to the people that you love and it'll be okay. And sometimes it's not okay. Mend differences while you can. It may be too late when you're ready. Yeah, that's a really interesting one, Beth, of when you have a fight with someone, of sort of that, there's that moment of waiting until you're ready, which is very important, I think, taking the time until you're ready. But sometimes if you wait too long, I don't know in this case, was Rabbi Yochanan waiting until he was ready, or was he just never going to get to that place? But that balance of both waiting until you're ready and also you have to do it now. It's an interesting question. Why didn't his sister appeal to his love for Reish Lakish, right? Why doesn't the sister say to him, you love him? What are you doing to each other? He loves you and you love him. This is crazy. That's a very interesting question, right? That's also could have been, if you wanted to pause and rewrite the story, you could have rewritten that conversation too. Maybe one of them should have asked for forgiveness. There's a great story about a rabbi who felt that he had been wronged. And so he would, around Yom Kippur, he would every day walk back and forth in front of the house of the person who he felt had wronged him to make himself available so that person would see them and be like, oh, I had been meaning to ask for your forgiveness. But yeah, you get the sense in this story that they're both so deeply hurt and offended that they just go off into their own corners, and there's not even that possibility of asking for forgiveness, that neither of them is able to humble themselves. Be the people you care about, and words are powerful. Don't demean a person's character, which is going back to, I mean, Lindy, this is part of what it means to be in relationship, is to know that sometimes people are sensitive and people have triggers, and that Rabbi Yochanan should have known that this would be a trigger for Reish Lakish. Right, and once words leave our lips, it is too late. I think that's another teaching, I think, here, is sometimes in the heat of the moment we say things. It feels like, I think Rabbi Yochanan is maybe careless when he says the bandit knows his banditry. It feels like Reish Lakish responds too quickly. He responds in that moment of defensiveness. What would have happened if Reish Lakish had just taken a moment, had just taken a beat? What would have happened if Reish Lakish had said, what did you mean when you said that? Why did you say that? That was really hurtful. That was really offensive. Or maybe it would be like, that was really hurtful. And Rabbi Yochanan would say, oh, I actually didn't mean it in a hurtful way at all. I meant perhaps you actually do know better than I would. Okay. A lot that I think that we can take from the story. For me, I think what's particularly powerful about the story that I think that the Gemara is showing us, remember, the rabbis, anything that's in the Gemara, the rabbis are choosing to tell us. They're choosing to tell us a story, is that this is a story, ultimately, Reish Lakish is, at the end of the story, he's not a bandit. He's a great Torah scholar, and Rabbi Yochanan is a great Torah scholar. This is a story about two of the greatest Torah scholars who, over this sort of silly dispute in the Beit Midrash, dig so much into their own pride, are so offended that they're not able to bring themselves to ask for forgiveness, that they're not able to bring themselves to apologize. And for me, I think that there's something powerful seeing this happen. Sometimes we look to the rabbis to model good behavior. And I think sometimes we look to the the rabbis modeling bad behavior as lessons of what not to do, of we can actually learn from them, that the rabbis are human beings. And just as they struggle to let go of hurts and to let go of anger, sometimes so too we struggle. And we can see that in their stories as well. Right. It shows us even the greatest scholars are still simply human. Definitely. Okay, I want to leave the story because I want to make sure that we see another story in our time together. So we're going to put Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish aside. And we're going to move to the second text, a bit of a funny text in my opinion. So the second text also comes from the Gemara. It comes from the tractate on Nidarim, which is all about vows. Here's our story. I'm going to read some of it in the Aramaic because this is really a story about language and cross signals in language, of when words mean another thing. Do I really understand what you mean? Do I understand what you're asking for? So I want to read some in the original. Hahu bar Babel, the Salik le'ara de Yisrael. There was a person from Babylonia who went up to Israel. So remember that some of the Jews were living in exile. So there were Jews that were living in Babylonia and Jews that were living in Israel. And so in sort of the same way that someone can make aliyah to Israel now, there was someone who was living in Babylonia who went up to Israel, to a totally different place. And while he was there, Nasiv Itata, he marries a wife. So now we have, this is like an intercultural marriage, a Babylonian marrying an Israeli. And so now he has this new wife. So what does he say to his new wife? Amarla, Bishili li tre talfi. So he says to her, make for me 2 talfi. For now, I'm not going to translate that, and you'll see why. He says, make for me 2 talfi. Bishili le tre talfi. She makes for him 2 talfi. Ratach Allah. He gets boiling mad at her. Okay? He says, make for me 2 talfi. She makes for him 2 talfi, and then he gets boiling mad at her. So the question is, what goes wrong here, right? She did exactly what he asked. Okay, so there's a couple ways we can understand this first part of the story. It could be that talfi, there's a couple of meanings to talfi. So that might be at play in the story of sometimes we say things and we don't understand what the other person is saying. So it could be that talfi is a word for a really, really small measurement. Okay, so if we take that talfi means a smaller measurement, right? Lindsay says she took it too literally. So it could mean that he says, make me like a very small amount of something, and she makes him a very small amount of something. Okay, so in the case where talfi means a very small amount, what is he thinking in this exchange, and what is she thinking in this exchange? Like what goes wrong? What is when he says make me the small amount, and she makes him the small amount? What is he thinking? And from her perspective, what does she think has happened? So feel free to chat that into the chat. right? So one thing is you perhaps have what's going on. If there's literally a language barrier of what he understands in Babylonia is different than the language that's being used in Israel. And so there's this is a really cross-cultural, that they don't understand each other's language and customs, and it leads to, he asks for something, she does the exact thing, and yet it ends up that he's furious with her. She took it too literal, right? So in that circumstance, he asked for the small amount. She says, fine, you want the small amount? Meanwhile, you could still understand that two different ways, right? He asked for a small amount and she gave him the small amount. It could either be like, she's like, well, I don't understand why you want the small amount, but I'm going to do what you asked for because you're my husband and I'm just innocently going along. Or it could be like, you asked for the small amount and I'm going to give it to you, you dummy, asking for this small amount. I'm going to give it to you even though I know that that's not what you want, right? You could even there understand it different ways. She thinks he wants only a little bit of something, but he's asking for a particular food item, right? So we're going to see that in a minute. They both have a different meaning of small, right? So it could be amazing, Avi. So it could be, we think, because we're seeing the word talfi, that, what he asked for, he got, but it could even be that the meaning of small is different. Okay, interesting. And I think part of what's going on here in this text is, why does he get so mad at her? I think that there's different possibilities there. I think one is he's like, obviously I didn't mean it literally. I think another option there is he perhaps feels like he's being made fun of, right? Here's this Babylonian who's married to now this Israeli woman, and he's trying to speak her language. He asks for something, he gets the something, but somehow he's not happy with it. And he may perhaps feels he's being made fun of. Whatever happens, it's an interesting story because he asks for something, he gets what he presumably wanted, but he's still mad. Okay, there's another way we can understand talfi. How else might we understand talfi? Talfi could also mean in the Babylonian language, in the Aramaic, it could be drumsticks, chicken drumsticks, but it could also be lentils. So the other meaning of it, so this is literally totally different meanings. He says to her, can I have 2 chicken drumsticks? And he makes for her lentils, and then he gets boiling mad. Right? Again, you have to ask yourself the question of like, well, from his perspective, what's happening? Does he feel like he's being made fun of? Is she being deliberately belligerent? From her perspective, what's going on? Is she like, well, I just made for you the thing I thought, or I knew you wanted drumsticks, but I gave you the lentils because you should be speaking here, whatever it is. But you have to try to figure out what's going on from each of their perspectives. Okay, assuming the meaning is the small amount, that he asked for a small amount and she gives him this very little small amount, then he's going to try again. So what happens in the next stage? The next day, he said to her, cook for me a griva. What is a griva? A griva is a very, very, very large amount of food. And what does she do? She cooks for him a griva. So here we don't have that he gets mad at her. We don't know how he responds, but it's interesting that in the first one, she goes very literal. And now again, she goes, right. So he thinks, okay, I'm going to overcompensate. And when I say cook a few things for me, she cooks the few. So I'm going to ask for a massive amount. And what does she do? She cooks the massive amount, right? Again, how do you read her actions? Is she sort of being deliberately belligerent and refusing to understand? Is she just trying to make her husband happy? Does she not understand his customs? It's hard to know what's going on in this relationship, right? Is she just a literal-minded person? So she's just following what's being told to her. Okay, third case with them. He says to her, bring me to butsine. Now, the problem with the word butsine is what? Of course, it can mean 2 things, 2 very different things. It can either mean pumpkins or gourds, or it can mean candles. So he says to her, bring me to butsine. And what does she do? She brings him to shrage. What's a shrage? That's like a candle holder. She brings him 2 candle holders. So she brings him maybe what he asked for, but we're not actually totally sure what he asked for because we're not sure if he was asking for the gourds or for the candle holders, but she brings him the candle holders. Again, the question is, what is her perspective on this? Why is she choosing to bring him one thing, not the other? So how does he respond? He says to her, go and break them on the head of the bava. So first of all, what does bava mean? Bava can mean gate. It can also be the name of a person, the great sage, Bava ben Butra, a 1st century sage. So he says to her, he asks for this thing, the gourds. She brings him the candlesticks, perhaps thinking that that's what he wanted, unclear, or she's being obstinate, who knows. And then he says, presumably in anger, go and break them on the bava. Again, we're not totally sure what he means by go and break them on the bava and why he says that. So what does she do? At that time, the sage Bava ben Buta was sitting and passing judgment at the bava, at the gate. So how coincidental that Bava was sitting at the bava. What does she do? She went and broke them on his head. So for those of you that are saying she's just a very literal person, right? He says, go break the candlesticks on this guy's head. And she's like, okay, I'm going to go do it. Again, you have to ask the question. It's not clear from the story. Is she just trying to follow instructions? This is what my new husband told me to do, so I'm going to do it. Is she, again, being deliberately obstinate of like, oh, really? That's what I'm supposed to do? Well, I'm going to get you, I'm going to break it on the bava, and then the bava is going to come back to you, and then we'll see what he has to say to you, right? Who knows? So she breaks it on the head of the bava, and then he says to her, Mahadin de Amdat. He says, what are you doing? Sort of curious that this is the first time in the story that anyone says to her, what are you doing? It could have been in the other moments, like when he says, he asked for the vutsine, he asked for the gourds or the candlesticks, whatever you want, and she brings him the candlesticks. It could have been that there he would say, I didn't ask for this. Why did you bring me this? But he doesn't. He just says, go and break them on the bava. But it's actually Bava ben Buta, the innocent party, that when she breaks these candlesticks on his head, instead of just getting furious with her, he has a moment of pause and says, what are you doing? Why did you do that? And she says, this is what my husband commanded me to do. And he says to her, you fulfilled your husband's desire. May the omnipresent bring forth from you 2 sons like Bava ben Buta. So he seems to say to her, like, well, I guess you were just doing what you understood to be what your husband wanted. Okay, so my question here is, so obviously there's something that goes very wrong in the communication between this young new couple that's trying to work it out. So my question for you is, what do you feel like, how do you understand this? What's going on in the story? And what might we take from it for our own relationships? How do you understand his actions? Why does he get so upset? How do you understand her motivations? What's happening there? And what might we take from it for our own lives? Right. So that's best. So that's amazing that you caught that. Is Bava Ben Ruta, the sort of the blessing at the end is a very strange blessing. She says, I did just what my husband asked. And Bava Ben Buta, this person who is not her husband, says, well, may your sons be like me, which is a bit of a strange blessing and not like you or like your husband. So, right. So that does seem to perhaps be a comment of Bava Ben Buta, perhaps is commenting on the husband and saying, well, may they not be like your husband who's saying to go and break things on someone's head or go and break things on the gate, but actually there's something wrong here. May they be like someone who is able to communicate better, who's able to stop and ask you, what are you doing or why is this happening? So Lindy says to try to listen and ask questions when you don't understand. Right. Again, this is also for Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Had Reish Lakish stopped and said, why did you say that to me? Or what did you mean by a bandit knows his banditry? If he had said to her, wait, why did you bring me these candlesticks? I was actually asking for the gourds. Or come on, when I said, can you make me 3 carrots? I didn't mean 3 carrots, to try to understand what's really going on. The cultural class. Yeah, Shippy. I think part of, I think it's so, there's so much absent from the story, which is part of what makes it so difficult to learn, that sometimes, I think when we miscommunicate with each other, there might really be bad motives at hand. Like it might really be that she, for some reason, is trying to make him feel dumb or is trying to make him feel ashamed or is trying to, that silly foreigner with his language barrier, she's being obstinate for some reason. Or it might be that there's a cultural clash, that it might be that both parties actually are well-being with well intentions. But for whatever reason, there's sort of the cultural background that they don't even realize that there's a miscommunication going on. And then all the more so, as Lindy was saying, that's the moment to then stop and ask questions when there's something sort of that feels like it's amiss, to figure out, wait, what is the thing that's amiss here? For friends and couples to be willing to talk and ask before you take offense. Right. But his wife could have asked for an explanation, especially after the lesson of the first request. Right. So Beverly, so maybe the lesson there is the first one, she thinks she did what he wanted and he gets boiling mad. So maybe she should have learned better to say, next time you ask me to do something, I'm going to stop and ask some follow-up questions to make sure I understand. Also, you could say the reverse on him, that next time he asks for something, he should provide a little more content to make sure that he's communicating his needs clearly, right? How often it is that we have a need, or we want our partner or person to understand what we want and to do something, but we don't actually communicate that clearly to them, or we're trying to do something for someone else, but we don't actually know exactly what they need. So we're sort of guessing around, is this what will make them happy? Is this what will make them happy? But what if we could actually just ask those questions? Why isn't she compensating for what she knows, that he is not so familiar with her own language, right? By asking questions about language that already has two meanings, this masks the subtext. Right, that they know that there's a language gap here that they don't seem to be addressing. I mean, to read the story for me, as, you know, he might feel that she's making fun of him, that he feels ashamed in this new relationship about not having the right words, I think makes the story really painful. And I think also explains why he might be so quick to anger and so defensive if he feels like he's being made fun of. From Awry, in both texts, we have parties with different backgrounds who have trouble communicating. Need to understand each other's backgrounds when communicating, right? So it's so important to understand the background and what might be the other information, all the different experiences and context and culture that causes people to say, and that's part of what happens with Reish Lakish, right? Rabbi Yochanan either was very much taking his background into context, which is why he made that horrible comment, or he wasn't enough taking into context, and so he didn't anticipate that Reish Lakish would be so hurt by it. Brits think to table something means talk about it now. Americans think to table something means let's talk about it now. Right, not now. Right, amazing. So that's a great, Rita. So that's a great example of you can have the same expression and it can mean literally opposite things. Okay, so I want to start to close out. First of all, I just want to really thank you. For me, I feel like the mode to learn these texts is very much part of the point of these texts and part of what I love about this last text is there's so much that's not on the table. There's so much that's not being said. And I think that this is really true in our relationships too, that there's what we're saying, but there's everything else that we're not saying. And that's, I think, where the miscommunications happens. And so I think the real mode to learn these texts is to get to really explore them together and to sort of talk about and debate, well, what's really going on? What did each person mean? How might we understand it? What are their perspectives? And so I really want to thank you for trying to jump into that in Zoom via the chat as well as you could. So I'm thankful for all your comments. For me, I think there's something very powerful to see the rabbis choosing to document stories about miscommunications, about struggles to communicate. And I would say that my blessing for us is in our own relationships, is that the next time that we find ourselves into one of these moments where we feel that we are being misunderstood, or we think we might be misunderstanding someone else, or we feel that anger boil up, the Aramaic there is ratach la, that he boiled up with anger, that we feel that impulse to boil up, that we can think of these two texts, these two Gemaras, really, that they pop into your mind, and it causes you to take a pause, just to take a moment to pause and reflect and say, why am I so triggered in this moment? Why am I so quick to anger? Why am I so defensive? What might the other person mean? And that these texts can be a sort of a reminder for us to pause, to ask questions, and to try to listen better so that we don't fall into the same trap that some of the rabbis have fallen into in these stories. So thank you so much for joining in, and I'm looking forward to the next time with you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Strausberg, and thank you all for participating in our program. We will be back next Thursday, 12:30 for the second in the series, and we'll be back on Sunday with Paul Lips. Many programs coming up. I hope you will join us, and terrific. Have a great day. Keep cool today. It's going to be in 80s, going up to 90s. It's crazy out here. It's crazy in the world, and I'm glad you're joining us just to share some time. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice rest of your day.
Bye everyone.